The 1970s, the absolute worst decade for automobiles. Except it wasn't, and here's why. Let's start at the beginning. 1970, the peak year for the muscle car. You had the Chevelle Super Sport 454 LS6. You had the Pontiac GTO Judge 455. You had the Oldsmobile Cutlass 442 W30. You had the Buick Skylark GSX. You had the Ford Torino Cobra. You had the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler. You had the Cougar Eliminator. You had the Boss 429. You could get a Hemi or a 440 six-pack in a Charger, a Challenger, a Daytona, a Super Bee, a GTX, a Roadrunner, a Cuda, and let's not forget about the small block pony cars inspired by Trans Am. You had the Trans Am Firebird, the Z28 Camaro, the Boss 302, the AAR Cuda, the TA Challenger, the Trans Am Javelin. And I know you're thinking, sure, but it was all downhill from there. But was it? Yes, big block pony cars did start to disappear in the middle of the decade, with the Firebird being the only one that carried a big block to the end of the decade. But most other classes carried the big block longer. And consider this, 454 cars only existed in the 70s, and engines actually got bigger before they got smaller. Some examples would be Chrysler's 340 was replaced by a 360. Chevy's 396 was replaced by a 402. Ford's 429 was replaced by a 460. And it is true that high performance options on these big engines did disappear. Things like upgrades to higher compression, multiple carb setups, performance exhaust systems. But these weren't even options on most cars, which was the idea of detuning during the 70s is kind of a myth. For most cars, detuning was nothing more than the addition of emissions controls, like a catalytic converter or the so-called smog pump, or a change in gear ratio to get better gas mileage, like from a 323 ratio to a 276 ratio. Some engines did see a decrease in compression ratio, but the biggest drop in horsepower that happened in the 70s only happened on paper. The industry moved from a gross horsepower rating to a net horsepower rating, and many engines lost a third of their power with nothing more than a pin stroke. No change in actual output, nothing different on the vehicle itself, but the advertised number was significantly less. And I will get a little more into that later in the video. To hot rodders, the real threat wasn't the loss of options that they were just going to rip off and replace with something they thought was better anyway, but the addition of weight. Some of this weight came about due to the so-called Big Bumper Law of 73-74, a regulation that required stricter bumper impact standards on domestic vehicles. It would be sometime later before imports had to meet these requirements. These new bumper standards could add over 100 pounds to the vehicle and dramatically change its styling. But where increased weight really came into play was the increase in standard features and popular options. Most mainstream American cars were advertising a bigger greenhouse with more glass, and this too added weight to it. But when you start adding things like telescopic steering, power seats, power windows, power door locks, power antenna, AM/FM cassette stereo, and air conditioning, the car's average weight really started to bloat up. Throw in some cloth seats and a vinyl top and a Brom badge, and people were trading in their muscle cars left and right for these nicer cars. There even became a specific market segment for better equipped small cars. Not only just packages on the smaller cars like the Brom Valiant or the Concours Nova, but you actually had secondary small cars built on the same platform that offered a more formal look and significantly more features. You could pay more for a Granada over a Maverick or a Diplomat over an Aspen. With the addition of all of these new features, there were two significant features that the performance-oriented people did really appreciate: front disc brakes and steel-belted radials. The importance of upgrading from a bias ply tire really can't be appreciated today, which is why most of these older cars have been upgraded to a radial tire. You get a smoother ride, better handling, better braking. Since a lot of cars from this period shared their platform with older cars, hot rodders will cannibalize these newer cars for their front brake system for their older car. And if you don't think people liked these cars when they were new, consider this. In the late 70s, the U.S. was in a major recession with double-digit inflation, yet nearly every American brand was experiencing record sales. Now, of course, the styling from this period is very period-specific. The long hood, short deck was the popular shape, particularly among coupes, where it was also expected to have a Landau roof with the upper window and light. But there were also attempts to add aerodynamics to these vehicles. Admittedly, a lot of these attempts were an effort to get an advantage in NASCAR, cars like the Daytona and Superbird, but also cars like the Pontiac Grand Am, which was essentially just a plastic nose, more aerodynamic Le Mans. And of course, downsizing came at the end of the decade, the move to smaller, lighter, more efficient vehicles. After 2 decades of cars continually getting bigger, the U.S. market even moved into smaller segments, with subcompacts becoming popular. Some people will refer to this as the import invasion, but to be honest, during the 70s, the import invasion wasn't really much of an invasion. Some American brands were importing cars under their own banner to fill these subcompact segments, and there was an increase in sales among Japanese brands, but most of those sales came at the cost of smaller European brands like Fiat and Peugeot and Renault, not at the cost of the American manufacturers. In fact, at the end of the 1970s, the American brands still seemed so dominant that most imports were considered inconsequential. So what I want to do here is take a look at a couple of American cars and how they progressed through the 70s and see if that matches how you think they progressed during the 70s. And we're going to do 2 slightly different perspectives. I want to start with the Chevy Chevelle. Since we mentioned the LS6 at the beginning of the video, it seems like a good place to look at how things progressed throughout the decade. Now, a 454 Super Sport Chevelle was a significant performer. It would do 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds and the quarter mile in about 14.5 seconds. And that was the standard Super Sport 454. The LS6 could easily knock half a second off of those numbers with 90 more horsepower. But keep in mind, very few of these cars actually sold. Chevy made some 4,000 LS6 cars and sold over 300,000 Chevelles in 1970. Small block V8s were significantly more popular, and you could get a 6-cylinder, which was also more popular than the biggest engines. In 1971, most Chevelle engines lost somewhere between 5 and 10 horsepower, not enough to have a significant impact on performance. In 1972, on paper, Chevelle engines lost 80 to 95 horsepower across the board, with no actual changes to the cars. Whether you got a 6-cylinder, a 350, or a 454, there was no change of the performance of these cars. The base 454 horsepower rating dropped from 365 to 285, a 354 barrel from 270 to 175, and a 352 barrel from 245 to 165. But a base 454 Super Sport could still be a sub-15 second car. In 1973, the Chevelle was restyled on the same platform with the new, bigger, safer bumpers, with the catalytic converter, with more glass space, with more features, and your average small block V8 car gained almost 300 pounds and lost about a half a second in 0 to 60 in quarter mile times. And yes, horsepower ratings did drop marginally. And this design carried on through 1977 with minimal changes. The six-cylinder actually gained some power over those years. The 454 was dropped due to lack of sales. And the smaller 5-liter or 307 V8 actually gained popularity. But the Chevelle was completely redesigned in 1978 to a smaller, lighter car. The top engine in this new car was a small 305 cubic inch 5-liter V8 that was only rated at 145 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque. And yet, it was still quicker, 0 to 60 in a quarter mile, than the previous 354 barrel car. The newly available 3.8-liter Buick V6, quicker than the previous 5-liter car. And the smaller 3.3-liter V6 is not only quicker than the previous 6-cylinder car, but got significantly better gas mileage. So even though it's true that you couldn't get a Super Sport 350 or any kind of Super Sport Malibu by the end of the decade, the popular selling models weren't really that much slower than the popular selling models were at the beginning of the decade. Now, since that's only one example and one way to look at it, we're going to look at it from a slightly different perspective. And this time we're going to just follow a platform, in this case, the Chrysler B-Body. For those of you that don't know, the Chrysler B-Body was introduced in the early 1960s as the new, slightly lighter, full-size platform. It included the Chrysler New Yorker and 300, the Dodge Polara and Monaco, the Plymouth Belvedere and Fury, but it proved to be too small or the wrong direction as far as the market was concerned. And Chrysler came up with a new, bigger C-Body to be their full-size platform in 1965, and the B-Body became the mid-size platform. So it carried on as the Dodge Coronet and Plymouth Belvedere Satellite. And over the next couple of years was joined by the Charger, GTX, Roadrunner. But we're going to start our focus on the 1970 Dodge Coronet 4-door sedan, your average mid-size sedan of the time. Our base engine was a 225 slant 6, rated at 145 horsepower. The big engine was a 383, rated at 330 horsepower. And the popular engine was a 318 two-barrel, rated at 230 horsepower. 318 would do the quarter mile in about 16 and a half seconds, 383 in about 15 seconds. The cars were restyled in 1971, and the 383 was detuned to about 300 horsepower. And overall, the car gained about 100 pounds with this restyle. Again, in 1972, the ratings changed. On paper, the Slant 6 lost 35 horsepower, the 318 75 horsepower, and the 383 was replaced by a 400, but still on paper lost 50 horsepower. Now, while the actual output on the smaller engines hadn't actually changed, the new 400 actually was producing about 5 more horsepower and 15 more pound-feet of torque than the 383 it replaced. So horsepower actually went up that year. In 1974, the new bigger bumpers were applied, and in 1975, the styling was revised. But, of course, the new bigger bumpers added even more weight. In 1977, the car received square headlights and got a new name. Instead of being called Coronet, it was now Monaco. And the old Monaco was still around, but it had been renamed the Royal Monaco. In the same way Plymouth had done a few years before, where the Satellite had become the Fury and the Fury had become the Grand Fury. And this car continued on through 78. 400 was still the top option, Slant 6 was still the base option, but they added more middle range options. You could now get 318 with a 4-barrel or a 360 with a 2-barrel or 4-barrel. But restructuring in 1979 meant the B-Body was once again the big Chrysler product. So now it was the New Yorker Fifth Avenue, the Plymouth Grand Fury, and the Dodge became the St. Regis to replace the Royal Monaco. The big block was finally dropped last year of the decade, and even though it looked like a bigger, heavier car, it lost about 100 pounds with this redesign and got quicker. A 364 barrel 79 St. Regis was quicker than a 400 was in the previous model. Even though there was a 318 4-barrel, the 318 2-barrel was quicker than the previous 364 barrel. So what we ended up with is, through this decade, we ended up with smaller, lighter cars that were practically as quick as they had been previously, while offering better gas mileage with more features, more safety, and better emissions. Hardly the decline of civilization as we know it.